The wind tore across the valley like a living thing, moaning through the pine trees and rattling the windows of Elias Harrow's lonely cabin. Snow hammered against the shutters, driven by the fury of a winter storm that refused to end. The world outside was a white abyss, swallowing sound and light alike. Inside, the fire struggled to keep its hold on life, flames bending low beneath the draft that crept through every crack in the wood. Elias sat at the table, coat still on, hat hanging from one knee, his eyes fixed on the dying embers. He had stopped talking to himself months ago. Out here, there was no one to listen, just the creak of the windmill, the faint groan of the rafters, and the heartbeat of the storm. His ranch had once been full of noise, the laughter of ranch hands, the jingle of harnesses, the voice of a woman humming in the kitchen. That woman's name still haunted the walls, Clara Wynne. She had been the fire that warmed him and the storm that destroyed him. 3 years had passed since she vanished on her way to Silver Pine, the small frontier town nestled at the foot of the mountains. The stagecoach she rode never arrived. The search party found nothing. No tracks, no wreck, no sign of life. Only snow. Endless, merciless snow. He still kept her locket in a drawer near his bed. Sometimes, when the loneliness clawed too deep, he'd take it out and open it. Her smile was still there, faint and fading under the glass. He would stare until the tears blurred her face into light and shadow, then close it again and curse himself for being weak. Tonight the storm was worse than any he could remember. The wind howled like wolves over the ridge, rattling the barn doors until he feared they might rip off their hinges. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, squinting into the chaos. Snow hit him in sheets, and the cold bit through his gloves like steel teeth. He barely made out the outlines of the barn 50 yards away. The lantern light trembled as he opened the door and checked the horses. They stomped and snorted nervously, steam rising from their nostrils. He whispered to them, patting their necks, but his words were lost in the roar outside. The storm was alive, and it wanted to swallow him whole. He was halfway back to the house when he thought he heard something, a sound too faint to belong to the wind. A cry. It came again, thin and distant, carried on the gale. He stopped, heart thudding, breath fogging the air. No one could be out there. No one survived long in this cold. Still, the sound came again, desperate, almost human. He grabbed the lantern and turned toward the voice, boots crunching into the drifts that reached his knees. The snow blinded him, wind clawing at his face. He stumbled forward, one step, then another, until his light caught something dark half buried near the fence post. A shape. He dropped to his knees. It was a woman. Her body lay twisted in the snow, hair frozen to her cheeks, her hands blue from the cold. Her dress was torn, nothing but thin fabric meant for travel, not survival. She wasn't moving. "God Almighty," Elias muttered, shaking her shoulder. Hey, can you hear me?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. He pressed his fingers to her throat. There, a faint pulse, weak but steady. Without another thought, he lifted her into his arms. She was light as a child, limp, head falling against his chest. The wind screamed as if in protest, but Elias pushed through it, step after brutal step, until he burst through his cabin door and kicked it shut behind him. He laid her on the rug near the fire and tore off his gloves. Her skin was ice. He stripped away the wet cloak and boots, careful to keep her decent, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He stoked the fire until it roared and brought water to a boil, his hands shaking not from the cold but from the sight of her, so close to death, yet so strangely familiar. He poured warm water over her wrists, rubbed life into her fingers, spoke softly, though she couldn't hear. "Stay with me now. You're safe here. You just hold on." The color began to return to her cheeks, faintly pink beneath the frostbite. Her lashes fluttered once, twice. Her breathing steadied. When her eyes opened, they were unfocused, gray-green like the winter sky. She tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped her lips. "Don't talk," he said quickly, holding a cup to her mouth. "Drink this." She obeyed, trembling as she swallowed. Then she stared at him, as though searching his face for something. He expected fear, confusion, but instead there was a flicker of recognition, gone as soon as it came. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Silver Pine," he said. "My ranch is just outside town. You were near frozen when I found you." She looked around the cabin, the old rifle above the hearth, the stacks of firewood, the empty rocking chair by the window. Her voice was barely a breath. "How long was I out there?" "Too long," Elias said. "But you'll live." She closed her eyes again. He watched her chest rise and fall, slow and fragile. He couldn't stop looking at her face, at the curve of her jaw, the faint scar by her brow, the pale gold of her hair tangled with snow. Something about her stirred a place in him he had buried deep. It couldn't be. He turned away, jaw tight. The mind plays cruel tricks in winter. He busied himself with chores to keep from thinking. He boiled more water, checked the horses again, patched a leak in the window. When he returned to the fire, she was sleeping. Peacefully this time, her breathing soft. Elias sat back in his chair and watched the storm through the glass. The snow hadn't eased. The world was still locked in white silence. Yet for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. The hours crawled by. He dozed in his chair, half listening to the crackle of the fire and the wind's low moan. Then, near dawn, he heard a soft sound. A whisper. He leaned forward. The woman stirred in her sleep, turning slightly toward him. Her lips moved again, this time clear enough to hear. "Elias." His breath caught. The name, the sound of it, spoken by a stranger's voice, froze him where he sat. He stared at her, the lantern light trembling across her face. No, it wasn't possible. He must have misheard. But she said it again, faint, almost pleading. "Elias." The fire crackled. The wind outside fell to a low murmur, and for a long, aching moment, he sat frozen in the stillness, staring at the woman who had come to him from the storm, his name on her lips like a prayer pulled from another life. The storm did not end with the morning. It lingered, thick and relentless, as if unwilling to release its grip on the valley. Snow pressed against the windows in heavy drifts, sealing the world in white silence. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light flickering across the wooden walls like restless ghosts. Elias Harrow sat beside the hearth, shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the woman lying on the cot. She hadn't stirred since dawn. Her face had softened in sleep, no longer twisted with the pain and cold of the night before. The firelight caught in her hair, pale gold now instead of silver white with frost, and it shimmered faintly each time the flames rose. He couldn't stop thinking about the sound of his name on her lips. He'd told himself it was fever, a dream, a coincidence born from delirium. But that voice, soft, trembling, familiar in a way that made his chest ache, still echoed through his mind. He had lived 3 winters with silence as his only company, yet somehow, that single whisper had shaken the quiet more than the storm outside. When the woman awoke, it was near noon. Her breathing quickened, and she turned her head slightly toward him. Her eyes opened, startlingly clear, a shade between gray and green, and for a moment she seemed lost, caught between dream and waking. "Easy now," Elias said gently, moving closer. "You're safe. Just rest. You've been through hell." She blinked several times, then swallowed, her throat still raw from the cold. Where am I?" "You're at my place," he said. "A ranch outside Silver Pine." She looked around, her gaze traveling across the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, the iron stove, the single table and chair, the rifle hanging by the door. Her eyes landed on the frost-covered window, where the light of the storm dimly filtered through. "How long was I out there?" "Long enough to kill most anyone," Elias replied. "But you're tougher than you look." She tried to sit up but winced. He steadied her with a hand behind her back. "Easy. You're still weak." Her lips curved faintly. "You talk like a doctor." He huffed a quiet laugh. "Just a rancher, a stubborn one, maybe." "Then I owe my life to a stubborn man." "You owe it to luck," he said, though his voice softened. "And to the good sense that brought you near enough for me to hear you." She stared at him for a long moment, eyes searching his face as if studying an old photograph. "Thank you," she murmured finally. He nodded once and stood, walking to the stove. He poured her a cup of warm broth, the smell of herbs filling the air. "Drink this. It'll help." She took the cup in trembling hands, sipping slowly. The warmth brought a bit of color back to her cheeks. He watched her in silence, unsure what to say next. He had forgotten what conversation felt like, forgotten how strange it was to share a room with another human voice. When she had finished, she handed back the cup. "You never asked my name," she said softly. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." A faint smile touched her lips. "It's Anne. Anne Winters." He nodded, the name sitting awkwardly in his ears. "Elias Harrow." "I know," she said, her voice distant. He froze. "What do you mean, you know?" She blinked, as if waking from a trance. "You told me last night," she said quickly. "Or maybe I dreamt it." Elias looked at her a moment longer, then nodded. "Maybe." The fire popped, scattering sparks across the hearth. The silence that followed was thick, filled only by the low howl of wind pressing against the door. Over the next hours, he helped her move closer to the fire, changing her damp bandages, coaxing her to eat small bites of bread and stew. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she managed faint smiles and quiet thanks each time he spoke. She asked about the ranch, about the land around Silverpine, about the town that lay buried now under 10 feet of snow. He answered simply, never saying more than needed. Yet the longer she spoke, the more he felt that strange pull in his chest, a sense of something remembered, something almost known. Her voice carried a rhythm that echoed from the past, like a half-forgotten song. As dusk deepened, Elias lit the lanterns and checked the doors again. The storm showed no mercy. Snow whirled outside, drumming against the roof. He stacked more firewood inside to last through the night, then sat by the hearth once more. Anne was awake, her eyes reflecting the flames. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do." "No family?" He shook his head. "None left." Her gaze softened. "I'm sorry." He didn't respond. He had stopped explaining that part years ago. Some things the world didn't need to know. After a while, she asked, "You said this place is near Silverpine?" "That's right, I think." She hesitated, brows furrowing. "I think I've been there before." Elias looked up. "Silverpine's a quiet town. You remember anything else?" She pressed her fingers to her temples. "Just flashes. A church bell. The smell of rain. Someone calling my name." She closed her eyes. "But it's all like pieces of another life. I can't put them together." He studied her silently. A lost traveler, half dead in a storm, with a memory like fog. It wasn't unheard of. Fever and frostbite could shatter a mind, but something about the way she spoke made his chest tighten. "You don't need to force it," he said quietly. "Memories come back when they're ready." She opened her eyes again. "You talk like a man who knows." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "Maybe I do." The wind howled again, louder this time, making the walls shudder. The firelight flickered across their faces, gold and shadow trading places. For a moment, neither spoke. It felt like time itself had paused, holding its breath with them. Then she said softly, "You've lost someone too, haven't you?" Elias's hands stilled. The question hit like a spark in dry grass. "Yes," he said after a long silence. "I'm sorry," she murmured. He nodded but said nothing more. Yet her words cracked something open inside him, something he'd buried deep beneath years of silence. He stared into the flames until his vision blurred. Later, when she drifted into sleep again, he sat alone by the fire. The snow had eased, falling now in slow, gentle flurries. The storm was breaking. He could hear the quiet between gusts, the kind of quiet that made a man feel both blessed and cursed to still be alive. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. His gaze drifted to her sleeping form. The blanket rose and fell with each breath, the firelight tracing the curve of her face. She looked peaceful, almost fragile, and yet there was a strength there too, something in the set of her jaw that spoke of endurance. He whispered to himself, "You're lucky I found you, whoever you are." But the truth was, he wasn't sure who had saved whom. The next morning brought silence. Real silence, the kind that follows after days of endless storm. The world outside gleamed under a pale sun, snow glistening like crushed glass. Elias opened the door and stepped into the blinding light. The air was sharp, clean, still. No wind, no noise, just the sound of his boots sinking into the fresh drifts. He checked the barn. The horses were alive, restless, but unharmed. The roof had held. When he came back, he found Anne sitting up, wrapped in blankets, watching the light through the window with wide eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "After a storm like that, anything looks beautiful," he said, hanging his coat by the door. She smiled faintly. "You sound like a man who's seen too many storms." "Maybe." She watched him for a while. "You remind me of someone," she said suddenly. "Someone from a dream, maybe." He met her eyes. "Do I?" She nodded slowly, brow furrowed. "I can't explain it. Just a feeling. Like I've known you before." He looked away, pretending to busy himself with the stove. His heart beat hard against his ribs. The universe had a cruel sense of humor, he thought. The day passed quietly. He gave her warmer clothes from a chest. An old wool shirt, thick socks, a blanket-lined jacket. They fit awkwardly but kept her warm. She insisted on helping around the cabin, sweeping the floor, washing the dishes, anything to move her body again. He told her to rest, but she only smiled and said, "If I lie still too long, I'll start thinking too much." He couldn't argue with that. By afternoon, they shared a pot of coffee at the table. Sunlight streamed through the frosted glass, filling the room with pale gold. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was almost companionable. Then Anne said quietly, "Do you believe in fate, Elias?" He looked up. "I used to. And now?" "Now I believe in timing," he said. "And timing's a cruel thing." She tilted her head. "Because it takes things away? Because it gives them back when you've already learned to live without them." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the meaning beneath his words. Then she whispered, "I think I understand." Night fell soft and clear. The moon hung low over the snowfields, silver light spilling across the floorboards. Anne lay near the fire again, wrapped in furs, her breathing steady. Elias sat by the window, watching the horizon where the mountains carved black shapes against the stars. It had been years since he'd felt this strange mix of peace and fear. Peace in the quiet presence of another life beside his own. Fear in the way that presence stirred ghosts he thought long dead. He rose to throw another log on the fire. The flames flared high, painting her face in amber light. She shifted slightly, murmuring in her sleep. He froze. Her lips moved again, soft, trembling, as though the night itself leaned in to listen. This time, she whispered not just his name, but a sentence that made the blood drain from his face. "Don't let me go again, Elias." His breath caught. The sound of it, so full of sorrow, so achingly familiar, cut through him like a blade. He stood there for a long time, the fire cracking behind him, the snow outside glimmering under the moon. He didn't move, didn't speak. The past he'd buried beneath years of silence was stirring once more, and it had come back to him in the form of a stranger who spoke his name like a memory returning from the dead. The sun returned slowly to Silver Pine, spilling gold over the frozen hills, melting the edges of the world that winter had stolen. After weeks of snow and silence, the thaw began, the slow drip of water from eaves, the creak of ice loosening from the roofs, the faint gurgle of a buried creek remembering how to sing again. Elias Harrow woke before dawn each day to the sound of change, the whisper of wind carrying something softer, kinder than it had in months. The woman who called herself Anne Winters was growing stronger. The color had come back to her cheeks, and she walked now with a steady step, though the cold still reddened her fingers. Her laughter, rare but genuine, began to fill the cabin the way birdsong filled the trees after a long silence. Elias found himself listening for it. They had fallen into a rhythm, an easy pattern that felt both new and ancient. She helped him feed the horses, mend the fences, and patch the roof where the storm had torn through. He taught her how to split kindling without breaking the blade, how to read the sky before a change in weather. She was quick to learn, and though she often moved with hesitation, as if afraid her memories might betray her, there was a quiet determination in her that reminded him of another time, another woman. Sometimes he caught her staring into the distance, eyes unfocused, as if she were watching ghosts walk across the snow. When he asked what she saw, she would smile faintly and say, "I don't know, but it feels like home, and that frightens me." The days passed gently, like water smoothing stone. The snow receded from the porch, revealing the old boards beneath. A single bird appeared on the fence post one morning, singing against the wind, and Anne stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her heart as tears welled in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Elias stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Means spring's coming." She looked at him then, the sunlight catching the gold in her hair. "Do you like spring?" He hesitated. "It used to mean planting season, long days, hard work. These days, it just means another year gone." Her gaze softened. "You sound like a man who's tired of counting them." He turned away, pretending to check the barn roof. "Maybe I am." She didn't press. That was something he appreciated about her. Anne didn't dig where she wasn't invited. Yet somehow, in her silence, she managed to make him speak more than he had in years. That evening they shared supper by the fire, stew thick with beans and venison. Outside, the last remnants of the storm whispered through the pines. The light from the hearth painted the walls in gold and shadow. Anne sat across from him, watching the flames. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked suddenly. Elias's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Sometimes." "Does it hurt?" He set the spoon down slowly. "Every time." She nodded, staring into the fire. "Me too," she said softly. "Even though I can't remember most of mine, it still feels like it hurts." He studied her face. The firelight caught something fragile in her expression, a longing without a name. "What do you remember?" he asked. She took a deep breath. "Pieces, sounds, the church bell in town, the smell of dust after rain, a man's voice, low, steady, saying my name. But when I try to see his face, it's like looking through fog." Elias's hands tightened around his cup. "Maybe it's best not to force it. Memory's a cruel thing. Sometimes forgetting is mercy." "But what if forgetting means losing who I was?" she whispered. He looked at her then, meeting her eyes. "Maybe who you were doesn't matter as much as who you're becoming." For a moment, they simply sat there, the silence between them thick with something neither dared name. The fire cracked softly. The storm outside had died completely. That night, long after she'd fallen asleep, Elias sat awake by the fire, the locket in his hands. He hadn't opened it in weeks, but now he did, slowly, as if it might shatter. Inside, Clara Wynne smiled up at him, frozen in time. The same eyes, the same curve of lips. He closed it again with trembling fingers. He couldn't keep pretending. The resemblance was too deep to ignore, the tilt of her head when she thought. The way she said his name, soft, drawn out, like a memory she didn't understand. But Clara was gone. He had buried that hope under 3 years of snow. The world didn't give back what it took. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the cabin, turning the frost on the window into tiny rainbows. Anne was already awake, sweeping the floor with the broom she'd insisted on mending herself. Her hair was tied back, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. When she saw him, she smiled, and something inside him shifted, unsteady and unguarded. "You work too much," he said. "I rest too much," she countered. "Let me earn my keep." He chuckled. "You're my guest, not my ranch hand." She looked up at him, eyes bright. "Then let me be both." The words caught him off guard. He turned away, hiding a smile as he poured coffee. "You've got a stubborn streak, I'll give you that." "I had to, I think," she said. "Maybe that's something I didn't forget." They shared breakfast quietly, the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves. Afterward, they walked to the barn. The air was cool, but not cruel anymore. The horses snorted as they entered, restless for open pasture. Anne reached out to stroke one's muzzle. The animal leaned into her touch. "She's beautiful," she murmured. "Her name's Juniper," Elias said. "Lost her foal last spring. Took her a while to trust again." Anne smiled faintly. "We're alike, then." He looked at her sharply, but she only continued brushing the mare's mane, her face calm, distant. Later, as the sun climbed higher, they sat by the corral fence, sharing a flask of coffee. The snow was receding fast, revealing brown grass beneath. The air smelled of damp earth and pine sap. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked quietly. Elias thought for a moment. "I did once. Then I realized there's nowhere else to go." She nodded slowly. "I don't know where I'd go either." "Then maybe it's not time yet," he said. "Sometimes the land holds us until we're ready to move again." She looked at him with something like admiration. "You talk like a poet." He smiled faintly. "No, just a man who's had too much time to think." The days stretched longer. They rode the horses to the edge of the ridge once the paths cleared, where the whole valley spread before them, the mountains black against the sky, the river flashing silver below. Anne stood at the edge, her hair whipping in the wind. "I've never seen anything so wild," she whispered. Elias watched her, not the view. "It's a hard land," he said, "but beautiful when it wants to be." She turned, eyes shining. "Like you." He froze. The words hung between them, soft but sharp. She seemed to realize what she'd said and looked away quickly, color rising to her cheeks. "I mean—" "It's all right," he said quietly. They stood in silence, the wind carrying the smell of thawing earth. Something between them shifted again. A fragile thread pulled taut, ready to break or hold. That night, back at the cabin, she sat by the fire, sewing a tear in her coat. Elias was at the table, cleaning his tools. The light was warm, steady, painting everything in amber tones. It felt like home. Too much like home. She looked up at him. "You ever been in love, Elias?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Once." "What happened?" He stared at the knife in his hands. "She disappeared." Anne's sewing slowed. "You mean she left?" "No, I mean disappeared." He looked up. Stagecoach vanished on the way to town. They never found a trace. Not her, not the others. Only snow. She watched him silently, needle trembling between her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said. "It was a long time ago." But his voice betrayed the lie. She set her sewing aside and moved closer to the fire, her eyes on the flames. "I wonder if anyone's out there wondering the same about me," she said softly. "If someone waits not knowing I'm alive." "Maybe," Elias said. "Maybe they never stopped." She turned to him, her face half-shadowed. "And if I never remember?" "Then you start over," he said. She nodded slowly, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. "I think I'm afraid to." "Why?" "Because it feels like I'm betraying whoever I used to be." He looked at her, his heart heavy with things he couldn't say. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the only way to honor who we were is to live." The fire crackled softly. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes full of something that felt dangerously close to recognition. Then, without a word, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, small, trembling slightly. Elias froze, the world narrowing to that single touch. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They sat in silence, hands entwined, the fire painting their shadows against the walls. Outside, the last of the snow melted under the silver light of the moon. Later, when she went to her bed, he stayed awake again, staring into the embers until they died. He could feel the echo of her hand in his, the warmth refusing to fade. He wanted to believe this was just kindness between two lonely souls brought together by chance. But he knew better. Fate had a cruel sense of timing, and it had just started to thaw the heart he had long thought frozen forever. As the first light of dawn crept across the floor, Elias rose and stepped outside. The snow had retreated into thin white veins running through the grass, The river below the hill was free again, its voice alive, restless. He watched the sun climb over the mountains and thought of the woman sleeping in his cabin, the stranger who felt like a memory. When the thaw came to Silverpine, it did more than melt the ice. It began to unearth everything buried beneath it: grief, hope, and a love that refused to stay dead. And though Elias didn't know it yet, the snow had started to give back what it once took. The days that followed felt unreal, like a calm before something inevitable. The thaw spread across the valley, soaking the fields and feeding the river until its voice filled the air. The mountains shed their white cloaks, and the land began to breathe again. But inside Elias Harrow's cabin, the air was heavy with something unspoken, a tension that grew with every look, every silence shared between him and Anne. She had changed since the storm passed. Her steps were lighter, her laughter came easier, but her eyes had deepened, a storm of their own, swirling with questions she didn't know how to ask. Sometimes he caught her staring at the horizon, her fingers brushing the silver locket she wore beneath her collar. It was a small thing, delicate and cracked across the surface, but she guarded it as if her life were inside it. Elias hadn't asked about it. He'd wanted to, more than once, but something stopped him. Some small, trembling part of him that already knew the answer. On the morning the roads cleared, he saddled his horse for the first time in weeks. The sun shone warm against the snowmelt, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and pine. Anne stood on the porch, arms crossed, her hair loose in the breeze. "You heading to town?" she asked. "Supplies," he said, tightening the reins. "The pantry's near empty." She nodded, though there was hesitation in her eyes. "Will you be gone long?" "Half a day, maybe less." She looked at the ground. "Silverpine, I think I've been there before." "Maybe you have," he said carefully. "Maybe when you start seeing it again, something'll come back." Her gaze flicked up to him. "Do you want it to?" He hesitated, then swung into the saddle. "That's not my choice to make." She didn't answer. He turned the horse and started down the muddy trail, the sound of hooves fading into the hum of thawing water. The road to Silverpine was quiet. The fields glistened under the sun, and the mountains loomed ahead, their peaks still capped in white. He passed the old church on the ridge, the place where he and Clara were to be married. The bell was gone, rusted from years of neglect, and the windows were nothing but black holes in the stone. He looked away, jaw tight, and kept riding. By the time he reached town, the streets were half flooded, slush clinging to the wheels of wagons and the boots of men. The air smelled of wet hay and smoke. People nodded at him, faces he recognized, though most kept their distance. Elias Harrow had long been the man with the lost bride, the ghost of a story no one spoke aloud anymore. He tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. The warmth hit him like a wall. Shelves were lined with flour, coffee, nails, and cloth. Behind the counter stood Jeb Tanner, the storekeeper, older now but still sharp-eyed. "Well, I'll be damned," Jeb said, grinning beneath his beard. "Elias Harrow back from the dead. Thought you'd frozen yourself to the mountain by now." "Not yet," Elias said, setting his hat on the counter. "Need supplies." "Beans, coffee, lamp oil." "Sure thing." Jeb turned to the shelves. "You heard about the stage line?" Elias frowned. "What about it?" "Surveyors found some old wreckage near the pass. Been buried under rock and snow for years. Said it matched a coach went missing around the time you're—" He stopped himself. "A while back, anyhow." Elias's stomach tightened. "They find anyone?" "Not much left to find," Jeb said softly. "Just pieces. Some jewelry, letters. The preacher's boy from town rode up there last week to bless the site." Elias swallowed hard. "Where?" "North of the ridge, past Black Hollow." Elias nodded slowly. "Thanks." He gathered his supplies, paid in silence, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, something caught his eye. Behind the counter, on a small velvet cloth, lay a silver locket, cracked, delicate, and painfully familiar. Jeb noticed his stare. "Pretty thing, isn't it?" "Found with the wreckage. Brought it down last week to see if anyone could fix it." Elias stepped closer, his chest tightening. "Where'd you say they found it?" "Near the pass," Jeb said. Why? You know it. Elias didn't answer. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed the metal. It was identical to Clara's, the one he'd given her the night before she left for town. He flipped it open. Inside was a faded portrait, his own face, years younger, staring back at him. For a long moment, the world went still. The air left his lungs in one ragged breath. "Jeb," he whispered, voice rough, "that locket belonged to Clara Wynne." Jeb's face fell. "Lord above. You sure?" Elias nodded once, closing the locket and slipping it into his coat. His heart thundered in his chest. "I'm sure." He turned and left without another word. The ride home blurred into a haze of wind and snowmelt. His thoughts tumbled over themselves, the world shrinking to the pounding of hooves and the silver weight against his heart. It couldn't be coincidence. The woman he'd found in the storm, the one who whispered his name in her sleep, and the locket she wore, cracked just like this one. When he reached the cabin, the sun had begun to sink. Anne was outside, hanging linens on the line. She looked up, smiling when she saw him, but the smile faded as she read his face. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Elias dismounted, his boots splashing in the mud. He didn't answer. He reached into his coat and held up the locket. Her eyes widened. She reached instinctively for her chest, where her own locket hung beneath her collar. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "From the wreckage of the stage," he said. "The one that went missing 3 years ago. The same one that was supposed to carry my fiancé." She took a step back, her face pale. I don't understand. Don't you?" His voice broke, low and shaking. "You came out of that storm with no memory, wearing her locket. You whispered my name before you ever heard it. Tell me, Anne, who are you?" Her hands trembled. "I don't know. I don't remember. Try." His tone was sharp now, desperate. "Tell me who you were before that storm." She stared at the locket in his hand, then reached for her own. She pulled it free from her neck and held it beside his. They were identical, the same engraving, the same crack across the surface. She opened hers with shaking fingers. Inside was the same portrait, him, smiling beneath a summer sky. Her breath caught. Her knees nearly gave way. She pressed a hand to her temple as if her skull might split open. "Elias!" He froze. She sank to the ground, gasping, the flood breaking through. Images crashed against her, snow, gunfire, the sound of a stagecoach wheels shattering, screams swallowed by wind. Hands dragging her from wreckage, a fever that burned her name from her memory. Faces she couldn't place, voices she couldn't follow. When she looked up, tears streamed down her cheeks. "It was me," she whispered. "Oh God, Elias, it was me." He knelt beside her, his breath trembling. "Clara?" She nodded, sobbing into her hands. "I thought I died. I remember the cold, the pain, the light fading. I remember calling your name thinking you'd never hear me." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in 3 years, her name broke from his lips like a prayer. "Clara!" They clung to each other, shaking, the world spinning around them. The fire in the cabin flickered through the window, casting gold across the snow. For a long while, neither spoke. It was as if time had folded back, letting them exist in the space between loss and rediscovery. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were swollen but steady. "You searched for me?" "Until there was nothing left to search," he said. "They told me the storm took everything. I buried an empty box just to have somewhere to talk to you." She touched his face, tracing the lines that hadn't been there before. "You grew older," she whispered. "You too," he said. "But you're here. You're alive." She nodded, but her smile faltered. "Alive, yes, but not the same." "What do you mean?" "I remember pieces," she said softly, "but they don't fit. I'm not the woman you lost, Elias. I'm what's left of her." He shook his head. "You're her. You're Clara." Tears filled her eyes again. "Maybe, but something broke when that coach went down. I can feel it. The person I was is gone. The things I loved, the dreams I had, they don't belong to me anymore." He reached for her hand. "We can build new ones. She looked at him with a sorrow deeper than any storm. "Can we? You loved a woman who doesn't exist anymore. And I don't know how to love like her." The wind had picked up again, carrying the scent of thawed pine. The river roared below the hill. He held her hand tighter. "You don't have to be her," he said. "You just have to be you." She smiled faintly through her tears. "And who is that, Elias? Anne? Clara? A ghost wearing both names?" He couldn't answer. They sat together until the sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in fire. When the light faded, she rose and looked toward the mountains. "I remember that ridge," she said softly. "That's where the coach went down." He stood beside her. "You don't have to go there." "I do," she said. "I need to see where it ended before I can decide what begins." He watched her walk down the slope, her silhouette framed against the last blush of sunset. The snow crunched beneath her boots, soft and final. Elias followed, not close enough to intrude, but near enough to catch her if she fell. When she reached the ridge, she knelt beside a half-buried cross, a marker placed by strangers, the name carved faint and shallow, Clara Wynne. She touched the wood with trembling fingers, then turned toward him. "You buried me here." He nodded. "I had to believe you were at peace." She smiled faintly. "Maybe now I am." As the first stars appeared, she looked down at the two lockets in her hands, one from the past, one from the storm, and closed them together. When she spoke again, her voice was calm. "You gave me shelter when I was lost. You saved me twice, Elias, once from the cold and once from forgetting. But now I have to find who I am without the storm." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. She stepped forward, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Then she turned and walked down the path, the wind lifting her hair like threads of gold in the dark. Elias stood at the ridge long after she disappeared into the valley. The moon rose above the peaks, cold and silent. He looked down at the grave that no longer held the dead, and for the first time since that terrible winter, he felt something close to peace. The snow was gone now. The river ran free, and somewhere in the thawing world below, a woman he had loved beyond reason was learning how to live again. He closed his eyes, the wind whispering through the pines, and said her name once more, not as a plea, but as a farewell. Clara. Spring came slowly to Silver Pine, as if the land itself feared to believe in warmth again. The hills turned green in cautious patches, the river widened with meltwater, and the first wildflowers pushed through the softened soil. The harsh white of winter faded into color, and with it, the silence that had haunted the valley for months began to lift. But inside Elias Harrow's chest, the thaw was slower. Some ice doesn't melt with the season. It needs time, and sometimes it never fully leaves. It had been weeks since Clara left. She had taken only what she needed, a blanket, a small pack, and the two lockets clasped together in her hand. She hadn't said where she was going, only that she needed to walk beyond the mountains, to find the person waiting at the end of the road, even if that person turned out to be herself. Elias hadn't tried to stop her. He knew she wasn't leaving him out of coldness or fear. She was leaving because her heart demanded it. There was no room for anger in that kind of truth, only understanding. The cabin felt different without her. He still woke early, fed the horses, mended fences, and worked the land, but everything echoed now. The sound of his boots, the scrape of a chair, the crackle of the fire. He'd catch himself turning to say something, expecting her voice in return, only to face empty air. Yet he didn't curse the silence anymore. It had been a companion before she came, and now it was a reminder that he had known warmth again, even if it couldn't stay. He'd taken to riding into town more often. The people of Silverpine, who once spoke his name in hushed tones, greeted him now with cautious respect. They'd heard about the wreckage, the discovery of Clara Wynne's grave, and the miracle that followed. Some called it providence, others madness. Elias didn't care. Truth didn't need believers. It only needed to be lived. One morning, as he traded lumber at the mill, the postmaster waved him down. "Harrow, got something for you." Elias frowned. He hadn't received a letter in years. The man handed him a small envelope, the paper creased and travel-worn. The handwriting on it was careful, almost hesitant. Ann Winters, Silver Pine Post. He didn't open it until he was halfway home. He stopped by the river, where the water rushed cold and clear between the stones, and sat on the bank. The envelope trembled slightly in his hands. Inside was a folded sheet, the ink faint but steady. "Elias, I don't know where this will find you, whether the snow has gone or the trees have begun to bloom again. I only know that when I left I carried too many ghosts with me, and I've spent these days learning which ones are mine to keep. I've seen the ocean now. I stood on the cliffs and watched the sun rise out of the water, and for the first time I didn't feel afraid of what I couldn't remember. I thought of you then, of the man who gave a stranger warmth and never asked for her past before giving her a future. You once told me not to force the memory, that sometimes forgetting is mercy. You were right. I think I was meant to forget so I could meet you again, not as who I was, but as who I could become. If the world is kind, I'll find a place by the sea to stay a while. Maybe I'll grow something small, a garden, a life. Maybe one day I'll send for you, or maybe this letter will be all that ever reaches you. But please know this. I remember the way you looked at me that night by the fire, and I'll carry that warmth wherever I go. It's enough to keep the cold away. Yours, in gratitude and in peace, Clara." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. The sound of the river filled the silence between his breaths. He looked toward the mountains and smiled faintly. She had found her horizon, and somehow that was enough. The days that followed blurred into work and quiet reflection. Elias repaired the barn roof, replanted the garden, and watched the valley come alive again. He no longer waited for her shadow in the doorway, yet he felt her presence in small things. The way sunlight touched the floor, the scent of pine smoke in the evening, the echo of her laughter hidden in the wind. One evening, as he chopped wood by the yard, he saw a rider approaching from the road. The figure was slim, bundled in a light coat, the sun at her back. For a heartbeat, his chest tightened, but when she drew closer, he saw it wasn't Clara. It was a young woman from town, riding with a parcel. "Mr. Harrow?" she called, holding it out. "From the post office. Came in on the north coach." He thanked her, watched her ride off, then turned the parcel in his hands. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Inside was a book, an old leather journal, its pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. On the first page, in the same hand as the letter, were the words, "For Elias, in case the thaw reaches you too." He sat by the fire that night and read until the lantern burned low. The journal was a map of her journey, sketches of towns and rivers, fragments of memory stitched between pages of wonder. There were notes about the scent of salt air, about learning to bake bread from a widowed innkeeper, about waking one night to the sound of waves and feeling, for the first time, at peace. The last entry was dated 2 weeks earlier. "The snow never really leaves you, Elias. It becomes part of who you are, cold enough to remind you of what you lost, gentle enough to keep you from forgetting why it mattered. I used to think love was something you kept, but maybe it's something you release, again and again, like spring releasing the river. I hope you've learned to breathe again beneath the thaw." He closed the book and sat in silence, the fire crackling low. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. Not snow, but spring rain, warm and forgiving. He stepped outside and let it touch his face, his hands, his hair. It felt like the world was washing itself clean. For the first time in years, he took off his hat and looked up at the sky. He remembered Clara's smile, the sound of her laughter echoing through the cabin, the way her hand had felt in his. But the ache in his chest was different now. It wasn't the ache of loss. It was the ache of gratitude. He had loved her once, lost her once, and found her again, not to keep, but to let her walk free into the world that waited for her. When morning came, he saddled his horse and rode out to the ridge where her grave marker still stood. The cross was weathered now, the name half faded, but he didn't replace it. He simply knelt beside it and laid the letter there, weighted with a small stone. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and pine. "I hope you found what you were looking for," he said quietly. "You found me, and that was enough." He stood there a long time, watching the clouds drift over the valley. When he turned back toward home, he didn't look behind him. Some goodbyes didn't need to be spoken twice. Over the next months, silver pine blossomed. Children played by the river again. The town bell rang for the first spring fair in years, and laughter returned to the saloon. Elias helped rebuild the old bridge and fixed the fences that marked his land. Life, in its quiet, stubborn way, went on. But sometimes, on cool evenings when the wind shifted from the north, he would light the lantern by the window and leave it burning through the night. He never said why, but anyone who rode past his ranch on those nights might have seen its faint glow from the trail, a single steady light shining against the dark, as if waiting for someone who might still be traveling home. And maybe, far away, by the ocean's edge, a woman with gold hair and sea-worn hands would glance at the horizon and smile, feeling something stir. The memory of a light in the mountains, the warmth of a man's voice in a winter storm. When the snow melted that year, Silver Pine seemed to breathe deeper than ever before. The river ran strong, the grass grew tall, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias Harrow laughed without sorrow weighing behind it. He stood on his porch one evening, watching the sun sink beyond the pines. The air was warm, the light soft, and in the distance, thunder rolled over the hills. Not a storm, but a promise of rain. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of earth and renewal. Then he whispered, not in mourning, but in peace, "Goodbye, Clara." The words carried across the valley, mingling with the wind, the sound fading into the hum of the world reborn. And in that quiet, Elias finally understood. Love wasn't about holding on to what was lost. It was about letting the heart learn to live with what remained and finding beauty even in the spaces left behind. The snow had melted, the river was free, and though she was gone, she was everywhere. Every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every breath that rose from the land they once shared, all of it carried her name. When the snow melted, Elias Harrow learned that love isn't measured by how tightly we hold on, but by how gently we let go. Some hearts meet not to stay forever, but to remind us that even in the coldest winters, warmth can be found again. His story isn't one of loss, but of remembrance, forgiveness, and the quiet grace of moving forward with love still alive in the silence. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale brings the untamed beauty of the frontier and the timeless power of love to life. Ride with us through passion, heartbreak, and redemption in the wild American West, so you never miss another story that will warm your soul beneath even the coldest sky.